All right, I'm back for part two. So we just watched this video where there was this opaque box, and researchers taught chimps very complicated ways to sort of get this starburst out of this opaque box, right? And the chimps, they copied um, pretty closely, to try and get this treat out of the box, and they were successful. And the researchers did the same thing with young children, and the young children copied. I would argue maybe even more exactly than the chimps, and they got the treat out and fine. Then they brought in the same basic box. The construction was the same, except it was transparent. So the chimps and the children could see that you don't have to do all of these things that the researchers showed them to do, right? Tapping it a certain number of times, moving um, these cylinders. You could really just reach in and grab what you wanted. And the chimps, they watched the researchers do the complex sort of ritual, but the chimps, they kind of looked at it and they thought, okay, well, I guess I'll just grab this thing out. Whereas the kids went through all of the motions of this ritual and then grabbed the treat out, even though they didn't have to. And it may seem kind of puzzling. It may seem like, wow, chimps are smarter than kids. Yeah, that might be true sometimes. Um, but scientists tend to think that this difference is actually quite important in cumulative cultural evolution. So we don't always understand why we do exactly what we do, right? Um, when it comes to cooking, even your book has an example of, why do you need to beat eggs, sort of whip them up, before you pour them in the batter mixture to make pancakes or whatever. Of course, you might know this now, but maybe you didn't always know it. But if you don't do it, it's not going to turn out exactly the same way. Anyone who's really tried baking knows you better stick pretty close to the recipe, even though you don't always know exactly why you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do. So there is a role in mimicking exactly, especially when you're acquiring knowledge for the first time. Of course, teaching a college course, I encourage you to question things, to think for yourself, and so forth. But when you are learning a skill, oftentimes it makes sense to just learn all of the sort of motions first, right? Because again, if you have to reinvent the wheel every time, if you have to know everything about putting together an airplane from scratch, you'll never be a pilot, you'll never get to that point. It's enough to know how the controls work, to know something about aerodynamics, to know something about troubleshooting problems with the airplane. Of course, there's a lot to know to be a good pilot, but you don't necessarily have to know from square one how to construct an airplane, including all of the computer systems in the airplane, all of the minute physics that goes into it, right? You don't have to be an engineer to fly an airplane. And if you're an engineer, that doesn't mean that you can fly an airplane, right? So sometimes building complex knowledge means simply following the steps of what's gone before. And of course, there's a balance, and humans tend to have the level of intelligence that it takes to know, like, when do you really need to know more? Maybe you can improve on this and so forth, right? But that might be a crucial step that chimps are missing in building cumulative cultural evolution. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but there it is. So I already went over these, so I'm not going to linger on this, but it's in the PowerPoint if you want it. The types of social learning are social facilitation, a situation in which the activity of one animal increases the chance that other animals will learn the behavior on their own. Basically, you put paints in front of a child and a blank canvas in front of a child, and 1 out of 1 million times you'll have a Jackson Pollock. Boom. Well, probably more like 999,999 out of 1 million times you'll have Jackson Pollock. It's a nerd joke. I'm just kidding. I appreciate his art. Emulation is the process by which naive individuals, by which we mean individuals who don't really know how this process works, they might see the end state of a behavior, like this example I gave before of a chimpanzee mother cracking open nuts with rocks. Maybe they don't see that process, or they don't care about that process, but they're like, hey, cracked nuts, I can eat those, cool. And then they think, if I'm on my own, I might need to figure out how to open this cracked nut. How could I do that? And so they may kind of know the environment they were in. They know that this end state is something that is desirable. I've seen it. I know it's possible. So, how could I do that? That's emulation. Observational learning is imitating, right? Is what we saw the chimps doing at first with the opaque box, where they didn't know what was going on inside that box. They couldn't see, so they thought, okay, here's some people who got out the treat successfully, so I'm going to copy exactly what they do to get the treat out successfully. Okay, and that kind of learning seems to be the kind of social learning that best preserves novel things, innovations, right? Which is what building this cultural complexity is all about. You can look at the evolution, by which we're not talking about Darwinian evolution. We're just talking about increasing complexity or changes over time, or increased efficiency, or whatever you want in technology, right? How you go from something like bamboo rafts to these huge Chinese ships. They're called junks, right? What are the steps that it takes to get from something simple to something super complex like that? And you can sort of build out a schematic of the basic steps that need to happen, right? Oh, you could have floating objects, and they could be made out of a bunch of things, logs or bamboo or reeds. The next level of things is, instead of just sitting on a log, I could sort of dig out part of a log and make a canoe. Oh, a dugout canoe, cool, right? Or I could tie logs together and I could make rafts, right? You can do the same thing with bamboo. You can do the same thing with reeds for rafts. And then there's sort of like step-by-step processes to get from one stage to another, right? And that's cumulative cultural evolution. But you don't always have to start at point zero, right? And sometimes if you don't just follow the steps that have gone before, you're going to waste a lot of time, and your end result might not be what you hope it would be. Now, cooperation is something that we know other species do to some extent, other primate species, right? There's kin selection that leads to altruistic behavior, but none of the other species cooperate in quite the same way, to quite the same degree as we do. So if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, right, which there are contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that are just as modern day as anybody else. They're not, the technology may seem simpler, but they are just as contemporary humans living in the modern world as we are, just as intelligent. Don't be fooled by the perceived level of technology, right? But they are living in a way that we hypothesize our ancestors may have lived, in the sense of they're living in smaller groups than, say, people in state societies with large cities, and they are living off of the land, and they're not primarily relying on agriculture, for example, right? So oftentimes we'll use hunter-gatherers, modern hunter-gatherers, or recent hunter-gatherers to um, to sort of take away all the layers of things that have happened in state societies, right? Because that's very far removed from what the kind of lifestyle that earlier human ancestors were living, right? So if we look at contemporary hunter-gatherers and hunter-gatherers that we have historic information on, we know that there's a great deal of cooperation. So if somebody, if there's fruit in a tree, you know, bananas, coconuts, whatever kind of fruit might be in a tree, instead of everybody sort of fending for themselves and anyone who wants a piece of fruit having to climb up that tree and get that fruit, you might have certain people who are tasked with going up that tree, shaking the fruit down, right? And then everybody else can collect it. Now, people aren't just going to collect for themselves as much as they possibly can and run away and leave those people who climbed up the tree to sort of fend for themselves, right? They're going to leave a share for those people, or they're going to collect for those people, and everybody's going to share. Everybody does a certain part, right? And we find this in terms of also like divisions of labor. You know, some people may spend more time building shelters while other people are going out foraging or hunting. Some people may climb up the trees to shake the fruit loose of the tree. Other people are sort of gathering it and carrying it. So this actually ends up being more efficient, and more individuals can survive off of this and flourish off of this than if everybody is fending for themselves, right? So this is something kind of unique, very unique actually, for humans, the degree to which we cooperate. And that's even in situations where we're not closely related to everybody in this group. So it's not simply based on kin selection. Now, why would this kind of cooperation be at such high levels in human societies, if not for kin selection? There's a couple, probably more than a couple hypotheses. One is this mismatch hypothesis, which is that it really comes from kin selection. So way back in the era of evolutionary adaptation, you could hypothesize that we were living in very small groups of very closely related individuals, and kin selection is what shaped our psychology, our evolutionary psychology. And now we're living in situations where we're not generally in really small groups, and we're not closely related to everyone we're living with, but we still cooperate because that's sort of built into our psychology. That's one way to look at it. Your book goes into reasons why that has some issues with it. It turns out that in modern hunter-gatherer societies, for example, groups are not as small as you might think, and they're also not as closely related as you might think, because they have very flexible social arrangements and people can move from camp to camp. The other hypothesis has to do with this reciprocal altruism, with the idea that there's an idea of fairness built into this, that it can be adaptive if, you know, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, right? If I can do something for you that maybe you can't do, and then you can do something for me later that I can't do, it can be mutually beneficial. But there has to be an enforcement mechanism to ensure that individuals are going to participate fairly. Because if they don't, then that is a cost to the altruist. That's a cost to the person who's doing something for another without reciprocation, right? So there seems to be a cultural idea of fairness. There's this desire for fairness and reciprocation that seems to be part of our evolutionary psychology. But what is deemed fair differs by culture, and we'll get into that in a second. One way that you can show this, even in the modern world, is through something simple called the Ultimatum Game, that kind of shows you what people are willing to do and what people are willing to sacrifice in order to teach others a lesson on fairness, or to make sure that we are living within the bounds of what we consider to be fair. All right, so I'm going to transition to this video and I will be back.
We invited in pairs of people with all sorts of relationships, from total strangers to couples that have been married for decades.
My seat's better.
We'll see about that. You guys a little competitive?
A little bit, could say that.
So, how do you guys know each other?
My little cousin. I am his little cousin.
What's the nature of your relationship?
We're married.
Oh, you're married. Congratulations.
2 W's.
Twice the winning. We asked each pair to play something called the Ultimatum Game, and the rules are really simple. These $20 are yours, but you have to offer some of them to your partner. Now, if they don't like your offer and say no, then you both get nothing. If they like your offer, then you both walk away with something.
Okay.
You guys ready to play?
Okay.
A good deal is one where everybody wins. So, in order to make one, our volunteers will need to flex those empathy muscles to assess exactly what the feelings and desires of the person on the other side are. We're going to see if people who use empathy and consider the other person have more success in the ultimatum game. You're not allowed to communicate what you're thinking, talk about the decision you're making until you make it.
If he refuses it,
Then you get nothing.
then I get nothing.
Then nobody gets anything.
Okay.
This does not happen very often, so I'm enjoying this.
Here's $20.
Okay. Thank you.
1, 2, 3. Oh, I see that.
I think 5 is more than fair.
$5. Is this what you're offering with?
That's what I'm offering.
$8?
$8.
And the 12 is yours to keep?
Okay.
So you got $10. Is that
Got
your
$10,
offer?
yeah.
Okay. Katie.
I knew you were going to do $10. It's like, there's no way.
This is a Libra
Keep
thing.
it 19.
Yeah.
18, 19, 20. There's very little hesitation in there. Patty offers the full $20 to Ray. $14.
Because I love you, and I want you to have the best share.
Okay.
14 to 6 is the split. All right, do you accept Sean's offer of $10?
I do accept Sean's offer.
Congratulations, you've won the ultimatum game.
Wow!
We did it! I'll accept that.
You're going to accept the $8.
Yeah. I can buy some food with that. It's a good meal.
I'm going to accept your offer.
My measly little $6, but that's okay.
Right, you accept the offer of $5.
No.
I'm sorry, you do not win the ultimatum game, and you both walk away empty. Thanks. That's
You're
the
welcome.
whole game.
That's it?
Yep, that's the.
Well, we
but
just lost.
I want to ask you.
Yeah. Oh, well. Whose fault was that? I mean, you should have been more gracious with the offer.
Of the 10 pairs that came in, 9 beat the ultimatum game and walked away with something, while 1 couldn't agree on how much to share and, in the end, got nothing. When we asked the givers why they chose the amount they offered, the successful ones said they chose the amount because they thought about how the other person would feel.
After nearly 50 years of marriage, I had a pretty good feeling that if I gave her 8, she wasn't going to be too happy.
While the unsuccessful ones said they thought what they would do if they were in the other person's position. Why did you offer 5?
I was considering what Brett would have done in my position. He would have thought the exact same way I did and would have offered me $1. If I came up here and said, Brett, I'll give you $5, he'd say, sure, great. But if I said, but I get 15 and you only get 5, then it changes everything for him. See, he could have had 5 and he'd rather have nothing.
See, empathy runs a lot deeper than sympathy. It's feeling what another person feels rather than just putting yourself in their shoes. All right, Wig, you got your 8.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, 12. Do you guys feel happy with this outcome?
I'm happy with it because it could have been worse.
Patrick?
I'm very happy with it. Sure.
You did come out ahead.
No, but honestly, like, if there's kind of that line, if he'd had 7, I don't think I'd feel so good about it.
Why's that?
Same here.
Just
Like,
kind of like that. It's just,
A
you
little
know,
bit.
there's just kind of a line.
Yeah.
I
You think
feel
he'd
like-
be unsatisfied?
Yeah, I wouldn't feel good about it.
Tom, even though you're walking away with less, how do you feel?
I think I walked away with more. More because she's happy, and her happiness means more to me than a few dollars.
You handed over the full $20. Are you happy with your decision?
I'm very happy with that decision. It's pretty easy.
Why?
That's my baby. I'll give her anything. I'll give. You're gonna make me cry now.
If the situation was reversed, how much do you think you'd offer?
Same.
$20
What's
right away?
mine is yours, what's yours is mine.
It's not always easy to connect with people around us, like a stubborn coworker or a relative with a different worldview. If you're having trouble seeing things from another person's point of view, ask yourself, are you just putting yourself in their position, or are you truly looking beyond yourself and putting in some real emotional energy into understanding their experience as a human being?
Oh, God. That's beautiful. Oh, I'm sorry. That gets me every time. Okay, so even though in this video they say that he's talking about empathy, that's part of it, certainly. From our perspective, it has more to do with the idea of fairness. So what's fair is going to depend on a number of things. It's going to depend on your cultural background. It's also probably going to depend on your age. And it's going to depend on how well you know this person, right? If you guys if you know someone very well, if you're in a relationship with someone, I mean, are you really going to give them less than you? Come on, think about it, right? And anyway, you're going to split everything no matter what, right? If you're in a relationship, most likely you're going to split it, especially if you're married. But if it's a complete stranger, it's kind of a different situation. So, although there is individual variation in what people are going to offer and how often it's successful, how often the other person accepts their offer, there tends to be sort of some kind of average that tells you something about a cultural idea of fairness, right? So, for example, in Western countries that are post-industrial capitalists, you might expect that there is a cultural value to competition, right? The profit motive, we're always trying to get a little bit more than we give. But there's clearly a limit to that, right? We know when CEOs get massive bonuses, even though their companies have gone under and people have lost lots of their retirement money, a lot of folks are pretty pissed, right? But we don't always feel angry or particularly jealous necessarily when someone does well for themselves and makes a profit off of what they do, right? So you might expect in a capitalist society that people playing the game are trying to win in the sense of they're trying to get more money for themselves, but they also kind of know there's a balance there, right? It's almost like supply and demand. There's a producer and there's a consumer, right? The producer is looking for a little bit of profit. The consumer is looking to get as much as possible for as little as possible, right? So you might expect that what's going to be viewed as fair between strangers in a Western society is that the person who can make the offer is going to keep a little bit extra for themselves. So if you have $20 and if there's $20 at stake in this game and the person making the offer offers you $8, you might think, okay, well, that's pretty fair, because I would rather have $8 than $0, and $8 is pretty close to half. Yeah, they're coming away with it with $2 extra from half, right? They're gonna get 12 instead of 10, but that seems fair, But in another society, in some kind of hunter-gatherer society where people tend to share a lot of things, they might not accept anything less than half. But nonetheless, even though the idea of fairness differs culturally and also differs depending on how well you know this person, there still is some idea of fairness that we all have, right? This also ties into theory of mind, because you're trying to predict, based on what you know about your own experience, about your own culture, about what you might do, about your assumptions about this other person. You think, what could I offer them that they would accept? Right? So that ties into theory of mind, because you're putting yourself in the other person's mind. You're imagining what they might think. And you're trying to successfully predict what kind of offer is going to be accepted. So it's really interesting. And under classical economic theory, it's predicted that humans are rational actors, rational maximizers, which essentially means that in this case, $1 is better than no dollars, right? So if you know the rules of the game are, you either accept the offer you're given or no one gets anything. If someone keeps 19 and offers you $1, the rational thing to do is to accept it, because $1 is still more than $0, right? But most people would probably reject $1, right? Why would they do that? What is there to gain? That's where this social enforcement mechanism comes in, right? We have an idea of fairness. There's no way that you're going to give me just $1. You're going to keep 19 and you're going to give me $1? You think that little of me, right? You should at least offer me something close to half, something a little bit more as a token. So instead of taking the dollar, which would actually be better for me than rejecting it in the short term, I'm going to punish you by rejecting the dollar, right? If I reject the dollar, I don't get that dollar, but I teach you a lesson. I teach you a lesson, which is, if you don't treat me fairly, I have the power to give you nothing, right? So it is rational in a sense. It's not rational in the classic economic sense, because again, $1 is better than no dollars. But it's rational because you are teaching a person a lesson which helps to reinforce a reciprocal altruism, right? So that's pretty interesting. So that's one of the ways of this altruism, this cooperation that's so common among humans might have proliferated, right? Even if we're not closely related. Now, if you look at the Ultimatum Game cross-culturally in these graphs, you can see the average offer, I believe, of a success, like the average successful offer, and that's the bars in the bar graph of these different cultures around the world. And on the left-hand side, you can see where those cultures are within the world today. The size of the circles tells you how many offers were at that amount. And then, where the circles range between 0 and 1 are, the full range of offers given, essentially, and how common they were, right? So 0 represents, obviously, absolute 0, and 1 represents the full amount of whatever was on the table for the Ultimatum Game. And what you can see is there actually is a difference between societies in terms of the amount that was offered, right? In this La Malera society, which I'm not familiar with, but it appears to be in Indonesia, the offer was greater than half on average. Okay, the largest share of the offers, the mode, if you will, seems to have been half, but the average is actually slightly larger than half. And in Quechua society, which is in the Andes, like in Peru and Bolivia, parts of Bolivia, the the average offer was actually between 0.2 and 0.3, between 20 and 30% of the total amount. So that idea of fairness differs greatly, but there is some kind of cultural convention about like what's a fair offer, right? Like if, perhaps in that society, if someone takes more but they give you something, oh, okay, that's better than nothing. Or maybe it comes strictly out of poverty that something is better than nothing, right? Maybe from a colonial perspective, they're used to people taking a lot, but as long as they're given something, okay, that's doable. If you look 2 up from Quechua, at the bottom there is the Hadza, and the Hadza are a hunter-gatherer society. And interestingly, the offer is also pretty low, which kind of goes against what I would have expected. I would have expected it to be closer to 0.5. So anyway, I don't know why that is, but there is a variation culturally. But nonetheless, some offers are successful, some offers aren't successful, but we all seem to know some of these unwritten rules about what is considered fair in our society, and we're willing to enforce those rules even if it comes at a cost to us in the short term, because we know in the long term, if we reinforce those goals, those rules, sort of those guidelines, that there will be reciprocation, right? So anyway, that pretty much wraps up this last lesson in this module. In the next day, I will try to put together a Kahoot just for review purposes. It's not required that you take it. You will still get full credit for this Kahoot. And then I will let you know when the next mini exam is ready, and you'll have a week to take it, okay? If you have any questions, again, feel free to email me. Hope you guys are all hanging in there. And don't worry, the end of the semester is near, and it's all downhill from here. You don't have a final in this class, so you can relax a bit, all right? If you need anything, let me know. And I'm signing out for now. I'll see you later.